So we live in tumultuous times, and it's certainly a common thing throughout history for Christians to see the times they're in, see how bad they think it is, and particularly since when they were young, and how much worse it's gotten, and to look around them and to feel like, wow, things must be getting to a boiling point, and therefore, surely Jesus is going to be returning soon, and so they tend to interpret what's going on around them as if it's for fulfillment of Bible prophecy. It's a very common thing. We've got a lot of it going on right now, today, in this world, and particularly, I'm going to focus on America.
Aloha guys, and welcome to another show. I am not in my usual recording space. I'm actually not in the state of Hawaii right now. I'm actually in another state, and we are making arrangements for my father who just passed away. It's been a very difficult week for my family and myself. So I'm hoping to get this episode out, but I just want to remind everyone to please take a moment to cherish your loved ones, to embrace them, to tell them that you love them. Don't take a moment for granted, because life is so precious and we only have each other for so long. So enjoy your loved ones while they're here. Today, our special guest is Brian Godawa. He is no stranger to our show, and he's back to delve into his powerful book on end-time prophecy, bringing us a fresh perspective on topics often clouded by modern interpretation. We'll be diving into symbolism, poetic language, historical insights that he's uncovered, what biblical prophecy truly meant in its time, and what it could mean for us today. So Brian's work really challenges us to look beyond surface-level interpretations and discover deeper truths woven into these ancient texts. So get ready for another thought-provoking conversation that might change the way you understand prophecy. And don't forget, guys, please remember to follow, subscribe, and leave a positive review. Check out our website, and if you have any stories you'd like to share, please email us. And also look at the links that I recommended for products on Amazon. If you click on those and purchase those, they will be at no additional cost to you, but it will support the show directly. Okay, guys, without further ado, let's welcome Brian Godawa to the show.
Well, aloha, and welcome back to the show, Brian. It's great to have you back again. Thank you again. Oh, yeah, no, thank you for joining us. And today we're going to talk about your book, End Time Prophecy. And in this book, actually, it's End Time Prophecy. It's not what they told you.
No, it's actually End Times Bible Prophecy. It's
End
not
time,
what they told you.
End Time Bible Prophecy. It's not what they told you.
There we go.
And yes, sorry, thank you. My notes all got deleted after I redid it. So anyway, sorry. So in this book, you delve deep into the layers of prophecy and how the Bible intertwines history and spiritual truth. So I'm really excited to dive into those themes with you today. So maybe if you want to start, what is this book? What are you talking about in this book?
Well, you're opening a can of worms, Mia, don't you know?
That's okay.
Yeah, well, today, I mean, to put it in context, of course, we live in a crazy world. Things are just out of control, as we see around us, politically, not just in the United States, but in countries all over. We've got massive attempts by totalitarian regimes or parties of people who are trying to, take over control the world, quite frankly, and I'm not even a conspiracy theorist. And as well as, suppress freedom of speech all around the world, including America. And so we live in tumultuous times, and um, it's 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 certainly a common thing throughout history for Christians to see the times they're in, see how bad they think it is, and particularly since when they were young, and how much worse it's gotten, and to look around them and to feel like, wow, um, things must be getting to a boiling point, and therefore, surely Jesus is going to be returning soon, and so they tend to interpret what's going on around them as if it's for fulfillment of Bible prophecy. It's a very common thing. We've got a lot of it going on right now today in this world. And particularly, I'm going to focus on Americans. And so Christians do this they're always doing it. They've always done it throughout history, but particularly you look at the decades and you see how history changes and the bad guys change or slide around back and forth, right? And so every decade or so, every half a century, so everything's reinterpreted in the Bible to apply to our time period, to apply to our era, to say we are the last generation, surely, before Jesus returns. And if you look at the history of that, you'll see that Christians have always been wrong, always, for 1,000 years or more. But particularly if you just focus even just within the last 100 years or 150 years, right? You see that Christians have always been wrong about these prognostications. And so you have to start to ask yourself, if I want to be true to the Bible, do I then have to conclude that the Bible's wrong? Or do I have to conclude that maybe Christians are interpreting the Bible fallaciously, incorrectly? Maybe their understanding of Bible prophecy is not what the Bible's saying. So I often say, like, look, if you look and see how these people have been wrong for hundreds of years, and you have to ask yourself, maybe it's not the specific interpreters. Oh, we're wrong this time, or we were wrong last time, but now we're right this time, right? Since it happens over and over and over again, you have to start asking yourself, maybe it's the system of interpretation itself that is fallacious. And sure enough, what I'm getting to is, if you do a study on eschatology, the study of last things in the Bible, you'll find that there are multiple theories about these things, about eschatology, and there's a handful of major ones with slight variations. The major theories you have out there are, premillennialism, which is the belief that Christ returns before the millennium, the 1,000-year reign that the Bible supposedly talks about. There's the postmillennial who believes that Christ returns after the 1,000-year reign, which is more of a spiritual, figurative reign, or it's not figurative, actually spiritual reign. And then amillennial, which is that the millennium itself is going on now, and it's a spiritual reign, and various other examples. But the dominant view that for the last 150 years has been what's called dispensationalism, or as I like to simplify it, the left behind view. Everybody knows about left behind, right? We're going to be raptured out of here. Antichrist takes power. He's a good guy at first. Then he makes a treaty with Israel and goes back and rebuilds the temple. And then he has a treaty with Israel. And in 3.5 years, he breaks it. And then there's the Great Tribulation. All this paradigm that's very, very popular, very well known now, even to the point where atheists can recount it for you, right? This dispensational view, it's part of the premillennial camp, but I call it, to make it generic, I call it a futurist view, which means that end times, last days Bible prophecy is about the future and about our future, rather than our past. And so this is the dominant view that we see out there. And of course, today it's going, hog wire, like wildfire, right out there. And I've had a problem with this view for decades. I mean, when I was first raised as a Christian, I got into it just like everybody else, and I had actually read Hal Lindsey's book. That's from the 70s. He was one of the more famous popularizers of the view that ultimately became Left Behind, right? And so I believed that view as well, and I held it for years. But there was things that had bothered me over the years. One was this notion, finding out how, there are multiple ways of interpreting Bible prophecy, not just that one way. And they're all held by godly men throughout history and scholars. So you can't just say, well, I just take the Bible literally, and this is what it is, the rapture and the Antichrist and all this stuff. You can't just say that that's what the Bible says. You have to say that's how you interpret it, because there are multiple different interpretations. And then secondly was these failures, how, I would look and see how, wow, they've always believed that their end time is or their generation is the last generation, right? And so they keep changing the Bible prophecies in Ezekiel and all these passages to apply to their era, but they're always wrong. And that had bothered me for a long time. And so eventually I did come into contact with a view that I'll call preterism, and that's more well known nowadays than it was back then. Preterism, the word preterism means in the past, and it basically is the argument that most, if not all, but at least most of the last days prophecies that we read about in the Bible have to do not with the last days of the earth, but with the last days of the old covenant. And therefore, most all the Bible prophecy that Christians think is applying to our future now actually applies to the past. It was in their future, but it was fulfilled in our past. Now, that's a shocking thing to many Christians, that immediately they come to mind all their beliefs, about this or that Bible verse. But that was the system that I started looking into. And at first, because I was trained to think there's only one way of interpreting it, the Left Behind view, I thought it was heresy. This preterism, it's heresy, right? And I get called a heretic nowadays as well. But so you look into it and you start to see that all the fallacies that we keep seeing happening over and over again. We're the last generation. We're the last generation. We're the last generation, right? You start to look into those Bible prophecies, and I think what helped me to begin to change my mind was when I was introduced to the main hermeneutical principle of interpreting Bible prophecy, which is when you're reading a prophecy, particularly in the New Testament, if you're reading a Bible prophecy, in order to understand what those symbols mean, and it is very symbolic, is very full of symbols. It is about historical instances, but it uses symbolism. You have to, in order to understand it fully, you have to go back and see what those same symbols and language meant in the Old Testament. And you'll find that all the language used about prophecy in the New Testament has predecessors in the Old Testament. So you go and find out what that stuff means back there. Then you find out, it sheds light on what it may mean in the New Testament. And so consequently, one of the passages that had been a classic passage that everyone believed, and the Left Behind view believes is still in our future, is Matthew chapter 24. And that's where Jesus is on the the Mount of Olives, and he gives what's called the Olivet Discourse. And as I examined that and explored it further with this different viewpoint, I soon began to realize that all these things that we've programmed ourselves to interpret Matthew 24 are actually false. They're ways of us imposing our modern mindset onto an ancient text. And if you go back and compare the Bible with the Bible, when you compare what Jesus is saying in Matthew 24 with other passages that are similar, you start to find that this prophecy that Jesus is giving in Matthew 24 is not about our future, where there's some rapture and Antichrist, etc., but he was actually prophesying the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple that actually did occur in his future, but in our past. That was the event that occurred and culminated in the year AD 70. And so that is the sort of shocking paradigm change. And that's what it is. It's a different paradigm, which at first is hard to accept for people. And I was going through that I was going through that very same journey myself. But so my book, End Times Bible Prophecy, It's Not What They Told You, that was my attempt to chronicle my own personal journey as I was going through that revelation and starting to see Bible prophecy differently. And it's hard work, just like the Bereans. You have to study to show yourself approved. You have to really study all these issues to really get a grasp on them. But you have to start somewhere. And I recommend starting with Matthew 24. But one of the where do you begin? Right? I mean, that's really the problem. Because we're talking about whole paradigms of differences here, right? And so it doesn't help sometimes to just, what I'll often get when I'll talk with people and say, oh, that's not the mark of the beast that's going on right now. The mark of the beast is something that happened in the past. It had to do with, what are you talking about? And then they rattle off this Bible verse and that Bible verse, and they don't realize that there are different ways of interpreting all the Bible verses they're talking about within a different paradigm. And that in order to be truly a Bible-believing Christian, you have to study these multiple views of things because, like I said, whether it's amill, premill, or postmill, they've been held by godly men. Even dispensationalism, the left behind view, they've all been held by godly men throughout history. And so we owe it to ourselves. You can't just dismiss all these other views. Oh, it's heresy. Or listen to what other people tell you. Don't believe that view. It's heresy. And they give a critique that you don't even know is not true, right? You have to look for yourself. And I recommend looking into the various views and seeing how they've got these books called 4 Views of the Millennium, 4 Views of the Rapture, whatever. I highly recommend reading these because they explore the different viewpoints and they help break you out of your blindness, your prejudice that you have because of the one view that you've only sought to inculcate in your mind. And so that's been my attempt out there. This is the big picture. We can step in and start looking at some of these Bible verses, say in Matthew 24. I chronicle them through the book and talk about them, but just to introduce you to, that's the big picture of the prophecy and how we are today in a polarized situation where Christians are just not talking to one another and they're dismissing each other with ignorance, prejudice, and bigotry. Yes, that's in fact what I would argue is going on based on their end times views. And it's sad, it's pathetic, and quite frankly, it's discrediting of the body of Christ because what you have people being proven wrong and wrong and wrong again. And unbelievers are now coming to the text and saying, well, you keep saying, you said that it was the last generation 3 generations ago, and it still isn't. So Jesus must be wrong, right? If Jesus said that we're the last generation, right? Then Jesus must be wrong. So you're actually creating a bad reputation for Jesus because of you imposing a false paradigm onto Bible prophecy. So let's before I go into any more details, does that help? Is that an introduction? Do you have any questions about what I'm getting at?
No, I understand that, and it makes a lot of sense. I don't want to ask my questions yet. Maybe I should wait, or should I ask?
Well, what do you got? Are these specific verses you want to talk about, or?
No, I was gonna say, what you were talking about, like the Bible uses that expression, which people talk a lot today about the last days, and that referred to the concluding time period leading up to that point in the Jewish system, which was the worship built around that temple in Jerusalem. I think it was between 33 CE to 70 BC, and that kind of occurred then. Do you think that the Bible also has not only a smaller local scale, but also a global scale of end times that we could look to? So some people think that there's 2 versions, a smaller version, and then we can look to that, and now there's going to be a global.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And that's another paradigm issue to talk about. And it's a paradigm of hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is it means the proper interpretation of text. And it's a legitimate one to ask. Another way of calling it is double fulfillment. You'll believe that when Jesus talks about in Matthew 24, right, he says, not one stone will be left on the top of another in this temple. It will all be destroyed. And sure enough, it was destroyed in AD 70, right? And then people say, yeah, that had its immediate fulfillment, but then there's a double fulfillment in the future when he returns or what have you. And that's a paradigm that would, that scholars have debated that forever. And in short, I would argue, no, I don't believe there is that. If you're going to argue for something like that, you have to argue from the text itself that there's an indication that there is in the text itself another fulfillment. People will, otherwise, what you're going to do is, if you believe that Bible prophecy can have multiple fulfillments, then what is your limitation? You have to have a boundary limitation of interpretation in which ones are double and which ones aren't. And why is there only double fulfillment? Why couldn't there be triple fulfillment, right? If you say, like Matthew 24 has a double fulfillment in the future, it doesn't say that in the text, though. And if you believe that, then every prophecy can be interpreted that way. Well, the Bible says that Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Yeah, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but there's going to be another Messiah born in Bethlehem again later. You see what I'm saying? It's like once you open up the scriptures to private interpretation, which means, well, yeah, I know that was fulfilled once already, but I think it's also going to be fulfilled in another way. You're now making it private, not public, which means it's up to subjective interpretation. And I would argue that if you see a prophecy that has been fulfilled, then there's no indication in the text that it needs to be fulfilled again or that it will be in any other way. You know what I'm saying? So my argument would be that no, I don't believe in the double fulfillment theory. And if you were to believe it, or if you were to what you would need to do to persuade me would be to show me that in the text there's an indication that there is a double fulfillment. And here's the principle. Only prophets of God have the right to tell us what the interpretation of their prophecies mean. So if a prophet, like like Jesus, right? If a prophet gives you a prophecy and he explains how it's fulfilled, then you have to follow his interpretation. But if he doesn't give that interpretation, then how are you ever going to know what it means? But if you say, well, I know the prophet, like I know Jesus said the destruction of the temple in AD 70, but I'm saying it has another meaning, you are now taking the place of a prophet. You are claiming that there's an additional prophetic meaning to a text that was not said so. So if you get what I'm getting at here, it's a subtle thing, but it's really what's going on when people say double fulfillment. What they're saying is, I have an additional interpretation. I'm a prophet of God. Are they saying this explicitly or consciously? No, but that's what you are doing, whether you know it or not, when you are claiming a new meaning of a prophecy that's already been fulfilled. So if a prophecy has been fulfilled and you say, but there's another fulfillment, you're claiming to be a prophet of God. Now, here's where the problem comes is we now have a history of false prophets in the church, whether they're, John Hagee or this Jonathan Cahn or these guys who keep saying, no, this is the blood moons 14 years ago, the blood moons, that's it. It's going to happen soon. And it didn't happen. Right. And so all these claims that this is Bible prophecy being fulfilled and they're not being fulfilled, that makes them false prophets. And so that's how I would answer that. So we are to seek what is the apparent meaning of the text and how it's fulfilled. And to go beyond that is to try to bring occultic or subjective interpretations to the text.
That makes a lot of sense, Brian. That makes a lot of sense. So I'll let you talk about the Matthew. I think you were going to get into that. Sorry.
No, not a problem. I mean, I actually want to. I look. If you let me go, I'll just monologue the whole time. But I want you to feel like you're you're engaging and you're getting me to address things you're interested in. Absolutely. Is there anything else?
Oh, I got a lot of questions, but I'll let you start talking and then I can maybe ask some of these because you probably will talk about it within your.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, look, I'm not going to be able to go verse by verse through Matthew. I
No, of
actually do a
course.
lot of that in the book, End Times Bible Prophecy, but I also have some podcasts out there where I've gone through verse by verse. And, you could, if you sign up on my website, godawa.com, you'll be able to, you can ask me and I can send you a link to those podcasts. But let's hit a couple of the big paradigm changers, right? You've already brought one up, the last days, right? So think about it, because of our modern bias, our modern prejudice, we read that term last days or even end of the age, which I would argue they're very similar. They're talking about the same thing, but with different emphasis. End of the age, last days. What do we think as modern Westerners? We think, well, that must be the last days of the earth, right? That must be the last days of all things and the final judgment and all this kind of thing, right? And so to us, it seems so obvious when we read the text, the last days. Well, here's where if you start looking into what does that last days mean? It's a last days, but it doesn't say of what, right? A last days of what? It doesn't say last days of the earth. And the end of the age is a very specific reference as well. So if you start to look those words up in other passages, it brings the full meaning out. Let me do that from some of these texts. So Hebrews 1:1 and 2 says, God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets in many portions and many ways, in these last days, he has spoken to us in his Son. So the writer of Hebrews is clearly saying they were, and Hebrews, all the New Testament was written before AD 70, was in that first century. Okay, so the writer of Hebrews is saying the last days were going on right then and there, right? And so, okay, that's something very different from today, right? So what does that mean? I would argue again that paradigm speaking, last days means last days of the old covenant versus last days of the earth. And the reason why is because the context of the Bible is covenant. You've got the old covenant, you've got the new covenant. And in the Bible, where I'll show you some passages, but just prepping you here, in the Bible, there's two ages. There's the present age and the age to come. Now, the present age was the age they lived in the Bible. And then the present age, the age to come was the age of Messiah. In other words, they thought we're living in this present wicked age, but when Messiah comes, he'll bring the new age, the age of Messiah. Sometimes they also use it plural, as in ages, meaning, there's multiple, if you can look at history and divide it up into ages, right? But nonetheless, the Messiah was basically the culmination of everything for the Jew, right? The ancient Jew. When Messiah comes, he would be the consummation of the ages, right? So in Hebrews 9:26, it says, again, he's writing at their time period, he says, but now, once at the consummation of the ages, he has manifested himself to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. So Hebrews is saying the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross happened at the consummation of the ages. So there you're getting this very different picture here. Last days was going on then. The consummation of the ages was going on then in the first century. What is it? The consummation of the ages is Messiah. 1 Corinthians 10:11. Paul says, now these things happened to the Old Testament believers. As an example, they were written for our instruction. He's talking about them in the first century, upon whom the end of the ages have come. So there's this clear picture that they were at the end of the ages, not in our future. It was there, and they were living in it right then and there, right? And boy, it goes on and on. I mean, there's multiple passages. Let's see. Oh, 1 Peter 4:7. He says, the end of all things is at hand. It's at hand. It's right now. It's happening right now. Therefore, be of sound judgment. The end of all things. What does that mean? Is that the last judgment? Is that all? No, he's talking about the end of all the things related to these ages that we're talking about. So my point here is just to say, and there's other examples. Okay, First Peter, let's see, 1 verse 10. Jesus was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but has appeared in these last times for the sake of you. Jesus appeared in the first century in these last times. So this notion is, and again, you can study this further, scholarship, even in extra biblical sources. They had this notion that there were two ages, the present age and the age to come. And the age to come was Messiah. Jesus is the Messiah. So it's not the age of Messiah at the end of the world. It's that Messiah comes and he changes the covenant, which of course has happened, right? The new covenant changes the old covenant, and the old covenant represents the old age or the present age for them, and the new covenant is the age to come. And the last days was the last days of the old covenant. Why? Because think about it. Jesus came, and this is how I have to explain things too to people. Jesus came and died, and he inaugurated the new covenant with his death on the cross, right? But the temple was still standing in the first century, right? And the temple was the incarnation of the Mosaic Old Covenant, wasn't it? It was where all the sacrifices took place, the atonement, the Day of Atonement, all the festivals were rooted, right? The entire sacrificial system that Jesus did away with was still standing. Not only that, but we read in Book of Acts that the apostles went to temple. So the first century is this strange transitionary period where the new covenant has been inaugurated, but it hasn't been publicly and historically consummated, because only when the destruction of the old covenant system in history and in public and on earth, only when that is finalized can you then say the new covenant is fully consummated and the old covenant is fully done away with. And so that 40-year period before the temple was destroyed, Jesus rose from the dead, the temple was destroyed. That's the transitionary period that they were in when they were writing the New Testament. And that's why they say it's the last days, because the last days are the last days of the old covenant. That was, as Hebrews says in, let's see, where does he say this? Hebrews, let me go there. This is a really cool passage. Hebrews chapter 9. I'm sorry, Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13. Notice I keep quoting from Hebrews because Hebrews talks a lot about the shadow of the old covenant versus the reality of the new covenant, and how the temple was just a shadow of the real heavenly covenant, right? So in the verse 13, he says, speaking of a new covenant, he talks this whole chapter, he talks about the new covenant. He makes the first one, the old covenant, obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. What does that mean? I thought the new covenant was here. I thought the old covenant was obsolete, but then he right after that, he says, it's becoming obsolete and growing old and ready to vanish, which means it hadn't vanished yet before AD 70. What he's talking about is that new covenant had been inaugurated by Christ, and the first one covenant was obsolete, but because the temple was still there, it was a transitionary period. It was becoming obsolete and ready to vanish. And when the temple was destroyed, it was finally publicly and historically vanished. So that's my long-winded way to try to expose people to how these concepts, we have to be careful not to impose our assumptions on them. We have to look into the Bible and see, what does the Bible say in other passages that illuminate these notions of last days and end of the ages and such, you know? So that's one example. Another big passage is, let's put it this way, another big element or component that determines how we interpret prophecy paradigmatically is this notion of the generation, right? Now, Jesus says in Matthew 23:36, truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. And then at the end of Matthew 24, he says, even so, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near. I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So how do you interpret generation, right? And this is something that, again, the futurist, because of their pre-commitment to a system, they reinterpret the word generation to mean something it doesn't mean in the text. So they'll read that and they'll say, well, Jesus must have been talking about the generation in the future, our generation, the last generation. We're in it, right? We're going to see these things, right? This is how they've interpreted it. And unfortunately, it's clearly not that way. If you look at the text, Jesus is talking to a group of people, his generation of people who are listening to him. And he says something like over 25 times in that whole passage of Matthew 24, when you see the abomination of desolation, when you see this, you should run to the hills. When you see that, he's talking to them. He's not talking to another generation. He's not saying when they see it. He's saying when you see it. So the context of the passage is Jesus is talking to his generation, right? And then when he says, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. I mentioned this before, a dominant hermeneutic of interpreting prophecy is if the prophet tells you this is what I mean, you have to follow it, even if you don't like what it implies, right? And so if Jesus is saying all these things will take place, this generation to whom I'm speaking will not to pass away till all these things take place. That includes coming on the clouds, that includes the famines, that includes the false Christs, that includes the tribulation, all those things in Matthew 24. Jesus is saying they will all happen within this generation. And now people might say, well, that can't be what it is because you're committed to a prior paradigm. But here's the key, here's the way to really say, well, what does Jesus really mean when he says this generation? It's, again, if you look at that phrase, everywhere else Jesus uses that phrase in the Gospels, in fact, in the whole New Testament, it always means the generation to whom he's speaking. It never means some distant generation, which would make nonsense because if I was talking to you and saying, Mia, you're going to see the inflation rise to 30%. You're going to see, the president, elect and all this stuff. If I start telling you those things, you're going to automatically assume, well, he's talking to me and these are the instances that are going to happen in my life, right? You're not going to say, oh, he must be talking to someone else, even though it seems like he's talking to me. That would be confusing and actually quite deceptive. But again, this generation is used actually multiple times elsewhere. And if you look there, let me go over some of the passages and you'll see how it clearly is referring to Jesus's generation. Not only that, but the phrase "this generation" is a derogatory negative concept that reflects the generation in the wilderness with Joshua. Remember how they rejected Joshua? There's giants in the land. We don't want to go in. So God says, I'm going to judge this generation for not believing me. And you're going to stay 40 years in the wilderness, right? That phrase, this generation, is theologically a hyperlink to what Jesus is saying, because wherever else he uses it, listen to the judgment. It's very much the same judgment of the generation that rejects Messiah. Matthew 11:16. To what shall I compare this generation? In the context of Matthew 11 is they're rejecting Jesus, right? So to what shall I compare this generation? For John came neither eating nor drinking, you said he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, you said a gluttonous drunkard. Yet wisdom is vindicated by your deeds. So he's saying this generation who's rejecting Jesus, the Messiah, is the ones that he's judging. Luke 11:29. The crowds were increasing. He began to say, this generation is a wicked generation. It seeks for a sign, yet no sign will be given to it but the sign of Jonah. Remember when they were coming to him and said, Jesus, give us a sign, right? And he's telling them, this generation that's asking me for a sign is wicked. The sign of Jonah is all they'll get. And what's the sign of Jonah? The resurrection of Jesus. So his generation rejected him and rejected the resurrection. Matthew 12:41. The men of Nineveh will stand up with this generation at the judgment and will condemn it. This generation that he's talking to. Why? Because they repented the preaching of Jonah. Behold, something greater than Jonah is here. That's Jesus. So he's saying, this generation that's rejecting me as Messiah will be judged greater than Nineveh and the queen of the south and Sodom and Gomorrah, right? I mean, it goes on and on. I mean, I could just keep going through this. Matthew 12:45. He's talking about this, the casting out evil spirits, and they come back with 7 more. And he says, when it comes back with 7 more demonic spirits after you cast them out, he says, the last state of that man who's now possessed with 7 times the demons is worse than the first. That is the way it will be with this evil generation. He's saying, you're rejecting me as Messiah, so it's going to be just as bad as being possessed with 7 times evil spirits, right? Matthew 17:17. Jesus answered them and said, you unbelieving and perverted generation, how long shall I be with you? Over and over and over again. This generation is referring to, Jesus is referring to the generation to whom he's speaking, who's rejecting him as Messiah, and they will be judged for rejecting him with the destruction of their temple and their city. And, specifically when I say this generation, he's saying the generation of Jews. That first century generation of Jews is guilty of rejecting Messiah and killing him. This, at this point, a lot of times people say, oh, that's anti-Semitic. See, you're saying the Jews killed Jesus. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the first century generation of Jews who did literally kill Jesus, the apostles themselves said that, right? Not me. They are the only ones who are guilty. No other Jews are guilty of crucifying Christ. Only the ones who did in that first generation, because Messiah came and they rejected him. And so God then judged them by destroying the temple and the city. That's how the paradigm's operating. But what that does to you now is, once you see that clarity, that's clearly what Jesus is saying. Now you go back and you say, well, now we have a hermeneutical key that changes the interpretation of the entire passage of Matthew 24, don't we? Because now Matthew 24, if you look at Matthew, let's see, if you go to Matthew 23:36, obviously chapter divisions in the Bible are not relevant to the original text. So Jesus goes, truly I say to you, all these things will happen upon this generation. And then he says, your house will be left to desolate, meaning the temple will be destroyed. The rock, not one stone will be left, right? So he's saying, this is going to come upon this generation. The temple's going to be destroyed and the city as well. And then they say, when will these things be? The end of the age, right? And I already told you, the end of the age is the end of the old covenant age, not the end of the all ages of history, right? So then he talks about the false Christ, the earthquake, the great tribulation, the abomination of desolation, coming on the clouds, et cetera, et cetera. Then at the end of that, he says in chapter 24, verse 34, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So what Christians do now is they go, well, that couldn't have happened because he didn't come on the clouds or the great tribulation, right? Based on the way I think it should be. Therefore, Jesus must not mean that first generation. But you see how you're blinding yourself. Rather, you should turn around and say, rather than imposing my interpretation of what all these things mean, what does Jesus say? Jesus says that however you interpret all these things, you have to interpret them as all occurring before that generation dies. And sure enough, Jesus was crucified in the 30s. The destruction of the temple happened in the 70s. That's 40 years. That's one generation. And isn't it interesting how it's the same 40 years as the Jews in the wilderness, right? But the idea here is, if Jesus says you have to interpret it this way, then we have to do that. So now you have to go back and say, well, then how do I interpret these things that I used to think were meant one thing, but they mean I used to think that the Great Tribulation was in our future, but now I have to say it happened in the past? Yeah, because that's what Jesus said. By the way, that's why great little book called Last Days According to Jesus was written by R.C. Sproul. He believed this view as well. And he was making the point that, well, hey, what does Jesus say about it? And it's pretty clear what he says, right? And so, so what I'm saying here is we need to interpret scripture not according to what we want it to mean, but according to what the prophets like Jesus are telling us to interpret them. So now we look at things like, well, then the Great Tribulation, then how could that have already happened? Because in your mind, you think, well, the Great Tribulation has to mean it's all the earth and it's the last judgment and it's Jesus coming back physically and all this stuff. But that's not what it has to mean. If you look closely at the text, you see that it doesn't have to mean that at all. So let's take a look at that big passage. Matthew 24, verse 20, as we goes, pray that your flight will be in the winter unsafe. He's saying, look, when you see the abomination, flee to the mountains, right? And he says, pray that that flight will not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. It's very hyperbolic language, isn't it? It's like, not been from the beginning of the world, not from then nor will ever be. It's the greatest tribulation of all time in all of history. We read that within our own context and our scientific sort of hyperliteralism, and we say, well, certainly that has never happened, has it? Because it's greater than everything. It's greater than the flood. It's greater than the Holocaust and all this stuff. But there's a problem with that. There's a couple problems. Number one is this is where the hyperliteralism, where Christians bring their modern scientific hyperliteralist bias. They think that they don't have a sense for the poetry and the symbolism of the Bible. And all of prophecy is very symbolic. And if you don't understand the symbolism, you're going to completely miss it, right? And the interesting thing is this phrase, such as not been, or this language, such as a tribulation that has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. Well, guess what? That language occurs elsewhere in the Old Testament. If you take a look closely, you'll see it's very similar. It's very much the same kind of language, the same phraseology. And so if you go to Ezekiel, well, let's see, let's go. Let's go to Ezekiel 5:9. The prophet Ezekiel is talking about the Nebuchadnezzar's siege of Jerusalem in 538 BC. So in other words, think about this. The exile, the Babylonian exile, was begun with the siege of Jerusalem, where the Babylonians destroyed the temple and the city of Jerusalem. And that happened in 586 BC, but it began in 538. And Ezekiel says, he's talking about the Babylonian destruction of the city and of Israel that was going to come. And he says, because of all your abominations, Israel, your disobedience, I will do with you what I have never yet done, and the like of which I will never do again. Think about that. The siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple and the city was never done before and never will do again. Well, if you take that hyperliterally, you're going to say the Bible contradicts itself, because the temple was destroyed again in AD 70, right? So this is clearly symbolic, hyperbolic language that is saying this is such a serious historical event. It's so spiritually meaningful that it's like, I've never done anything like this and I'll never do it again. It's so extreme. It's hyperbolic language. We use this language as well. We don't mean it literally, but it's a way of expressing something that is truly spiritually significant. And guess what? Daniel does the same thing. Daniel was also a prophet that talked about the Babylonian exile where the temple was destroyed in the city as well. In Daniel 9:12, he says, God, and he's talking about how God's punishing Israel for her disobedience. That's why they're going into exile. And he says, verse 12, God has confirmed his words which he spoke against us, Jews, and against our rulers who ruled us, by bringing upon us a great calamity. For under the whole heaven, there has not been done anything like what has been done in Jerusalem. There it is again, that same exaggerating or hyperbolic language. There's never, ever been done anything like this before. And look, it goes on and on. I mean, there's multiple passages like that. I could go on and on, but there's also, let's see, this language is used in other things as well, but it's used of Solomon, right? Solomon in 1 Kings 3:12, it says, behold, I now do according to your word. I give you a wise and discerning mind, and none like you. This is God speaking to Solomon. None like you has been before you, and none like you shall arise after you. Solomon, you're so wise that no one before you is as wise, and no one after you is as wise. Well, that's technically not true, but not only that, but it's not biblically true, because in Matthew 12, what does Jesus say? God gave you the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, I, Jesus, someone greater than Solomon is here. So again, if you're going to say that the Bible contradicts itself, you're going to be in a problem. But if you recognize, no, Jesus is greater than Solomon, yet no one wiser than Jesus is wiser than Solomon, yet no one wiser than Solomon will come after him. It's all just talking about a hyperbolic way of explaining this is how this man is so wise. He's like the wisest man ever, So my point here is that if you see the language of the first destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 586 BC, the same exact language is saying nothing like this ever before and nothing like it afterwards. And then the same language is used in Matthew, nothing like it before and nothing like it afterwards. Well, then clearly it's hyperbolic language. It's not hyperliteralistic. And it's interesting that Jesus is talking about this destruction of the temple and the city. It's the same kind of event, and he's using the same language. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. So, since many of the prophecies in the Bible are interpreted as already been fulfilled, my question, I guess, or maybe many Christians will be asking, what do Christians have to look forward to now? If these key events have already taken place, how do we understand what's still to come in God's plan for the future? Or is there a plan in the future?
Yeah. Look, we only have this hour, so it's understandable. In a way, your question is jumping to the end. And that's fair. It's fair because it does make you start to think that way if you start to think ahead. But my approach is, I don't know about the future. All I know is I want to know what the Bible says. And I go step by step by step. So first I want to find out, well, what's the Bible saying about this? Now, what does it say about the Great Tribulation? Now, what does it say about coming in the clouds? And that's a whole nother factor, right? And what does it say about the abomination of desolation? I want to find out what all of those things mean, and then let the text bring me to the end, right? However, like I said, we only have an hour here and we're wrapping it up. So it's fair enough to say, well, okay, if you say, and I would argue this, that Matthew 24 is about all of it, including the coming on the clouds. Jesus came on the clouds in judgment in the first century. And that symbolism, coming on the clouds, is a common Old Testament symbol that meant Yahweh, whenever Yahweh came in judgment upon a city, a town, or a people, he called it coming on the clouds. Yahweh's coming on the clouds, right? He didn't surf in on a cumulus nimbus. It was a spiritual way of describing he's judging the city through pagan armies. I didn't have the time to go step you through that, but that's in fact what's occurring. So So say you go through Matthew 24 and say, oh, okay, so that was happening in the past. Now, what do I have to look forward to? Well, there's lots of other Bible passages that talk about other things that may give us information on what we look forward to, right? But I'll go ahead and jump to the end with you and say, okay, look, it's actually quite simple. First of all, when I say that these passages of the last days are fulfilled in the past, and this, that doesn't mean I'm saying Christ is not coming back physically in our future. There are differing views on that. Some believe that it was all fulfilled and there is no future physical coming, that happened in the past. But many Orthodox preterists, what the term we're using here, do argue that no, most of all the last days prophecies are the past, but there's still a future coming of Christ. But even apart from that, it's like when you have a shift of paradigm, you start to also have a shift of lifestyle. I would argue that the thing we have to look forward to is actually quite simple and hard work. And Christians don't want that because it's not sensational. It's quite very simply, Jesus said it himself, Matthew 28:18. Therefore, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, right? Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptize them in the name of the Father and Son, teach them to observe all I have commanded you, and behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age, right? Even into the end of that age that was coming, he was going to be with them there, to there and beyond, to the stars and beyond. So the idea is we are part of a kingdom of God. And I also go back to Daniel 2. Remember Daniel's vision of the kingdoms and how those kingdoms would end with Rome, and the stone, which is Messiah, would hit the statue, and that stone would crush the Roman kingdom, and that stone would grow, the stone Messiah would grow to be a mountain to fill the earth. So what we have to look forward to is we are a part of a kingdom, the kingdom of God, that involves the building of his people through discipleship, through evangelism, discipleship, and obedience, and applying his word to obedience in our lives, which means everything, our personal lives, our family lives, government, whatever, applying Christ's obedience to Christ in all areas of life. And that kingdom, what did Jesus say that would happen to that kingdom? It would start like a mustard seed, but grow to be the biggest tree in the garden. It would start like a little bit of leaven in the lump of dough, but it would ultimately leaven the whole lump. We are part of a kingdom that is growing to fill the earth like a mountain. Isn't that glorious? Isn't that exciting to look forward to? We are a part of building his kingdom by discipling the nations. And yes, that doesn't mean the kingdom of God is only on earth. No, of course, God rules over heaven and earth, but we've got to be careful not to have this Gnostic tendency to reject earth as being, that's unimportant. The heavenly is what matters, right? The spiritual is only what matters. No, God is heaven. God's kingdom includes heaven and earth, and we apply his kingdom, and our obedience to him touches both of those realms. And so we shouldn't be afraid about that. And we shouldn't be looking forward to the Titanic sinking. We should be looking forward to God's kingdom growing to fill the earth, if that makes sense. And so that's the sort of optimistic view whereas the pessimistic view that believes we're in the end times now, everything's going to go to pot. So why bother? Why really think about it? If you're on the Titanic, why bother rearranging the chairs? Why bother fighting against evil in this world if it's all going to go to hell and the Antichrist is going to come up? We're going to be raptured out of here, right? The logic of that understanding of Bible prophecy is very detrimental to the body of Christ. We should be putting our hands to the plow, working to disciple the nations, and be a part of the kingdom of God that is growing to fill the earth. That is an exciting, the most exciting thing you could possibly think of as a Christian, right? And yes, you can still have, there are still within that paradigm, there's still room that there are passages that indicate Christ coming a final time or a second time in our future, but we're not looking forward to being raptured and an Antichrist and a great tribulation and all this kind of science fiction fairy tale stuff that's been made up that doesn't prove to be true. We're looking forward to being a part of the growing kingdom, and then Christ will return to finalize that kingdom. And in the 1 Corinthians 15 says he will take that kingdom and hand it to the Father. And then you have this glorious final state of everything. What that's going to be like, there's not much about it, and I don't know, and I don't know, but I do know what we've been commanded to do, and that to me is exciting. I'm not looking for the Antichrist. I'm looking for Christ and his kingdom and building it.
That's great. So do you think there's going to be a 1,000-year reign, or is that symbolic?
That's
And all the
that's a discussion that could take a whole hour. I
Okay.
am of the camp that agrees with the postmillennialists and the amillennialists. Both of those camps believe that the 1,000-year reign is actually, that's a symbolic term. It's obviously symbolic in the most symbolic book of the Bible, but it references Christ's reign. Elsewhere in the New Testament, it clearly says Jesus Christ reigns as king of all the earth right now in heaven, but he's over the earth. And so I'm of the camp that believes his reign is a reign from heaven over the earth. And so we are in the midst of that. If you want to call it a 1,000-year reign or a millennium, go ahead. But it's a symbol that represents his reign, and we're a part of that right now. So yeah. So it's a symbolic thing that could mean a long time, or it could mean a regal short amount of time, meaning, whenever they talked about kings reigning, they would speak exaggerated or hyperbolically about their reign to talk about how glorious they are. You know what I mean? And they did that with King David, right? When David killed one man, Goliath, and what did they sing? Saul has killed his thousands, David his 10,000s. There's always a hyperbolic exaggeration of glory that we give unto God through the poetry and through the symbolism that glorifies him. And so that's where the 1,000-year reign is just a symbolic reference to his royal reigning over the earth.
That's true.
Which is going on right now.
I have another question that's maybe, I don't know, controversial. I'm not quite sure. But since we're talking about this kind of stuff, so in your research, what have you found regarding what happens after death? Because Ecclesiastics, I think it's Ecclesiastic 9:5 says that the dead knows nothing. So how do you interpret that with the rest of the Bible's teaching of their afterlife? Like some people think when you die, you go to heaven, things like that. So
yeah, that's another complex theological issue. Very fascinating. But you have to remember, when you're reading Ecclesiastes, the context is, it's not on the surface. You have to understand that Ecclesiastes is sort of a interaction of two different viewpoints. There's the narrator, and there's the author. And so the narrator, the preacher, right? Vanity of all his vanities, right? And chase after wind. Well, a lot of what he says is true under the sun. I got to give my church kudos on this one. They've been doing a series on it, and they explained it this way: nothing new under the sun. That's the phrase in Ecclesiastes, right? Well, creation is under the sun, but God is above and beyond the sun, right? So you have to understand that sometimes the Ecclesiastes is talking from the mindset of the person whose heart and soul is not on God. It's not above the sun, it's under the sun. And then the narrator brings in the beginning and at the very end, the narrator brings in, nevertheless, this is how you see life, but nevertheless, when all is said and done, fear God and keep his commands, because this applies to everyone and we will all be judged. So there's this notion of a viewpoint under the sun versus a viewpoint over the sun. And so some of those statements I wouldn't take them literally, just like all proverbs are not universal. They're just generally true, but not absolutely always true, right? And in the same way, Oh, in terms of the New Testament, though, I'm convinced that it says that for believers, when you die, you go to the presence of the Lord. You are with the Lord. But in the Old Testament, there is the notion of Hades, or as that's the Greek in Hebrew, it's Sheol. Sheol is the underworld where the dead went and waited for judgment, right? But when Christ came, I think he opened up Hades for believers, and now believers go to be with the Lord until judgment, right? But not unbelievers. And so Hades is the world of the underworld of the dead. And like I said, you can see how there's a complexity going on there. But basically, for believers, I believe the New Testament indicates we go to be with the Lord. But I don't know exactly how that all works.
I wouldn't think so. You'd have to die and come back to tell us.
Yeah. There are lots, and again, good, strong, godly theologians disagree on the little components of all this stuff, right?
Sure.
And so it's like, do you go straight to hell and straight to heaven? Is hell eternal torment, or is it annihilation? Is it the second death? Is it permanent death, or is it just more suffering? These are all questions that within the Orthodox community there is still disagreement over, and interesting, worthy debates to be had, for sure.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, Brian, thank you very much. Where can our readers and listeners find you?
Well, I have a Godawa.com, my website. I have a lot of information on all my books and series, and got a cool stuff there to help for people who are interested in learning more. But you can just go straight to Amazon. All my books are in paperback, Kindle, audiobook, and some in hardcover, exclusively at Amazon. And if you go there, you type in my name, you'll get my author page. You can find out everything about me directly there as well. So yeah, that's where you can get the info.
And I loved your audiobook because I got that as well. And it has a lot of passion. When you speak it, there you emphasize everything, and I love it. It's really I enjoyed listening to the audiobook. I really did.
Cool.
So it's great. Well, thank you so much, Brian, for your time and delving into these deep and fascinating topics with us today. I know it's very complex, and we had to unpack it in such a short time. But hopefully our listeners will greatly appreciate the wisdom that you
challenging and
today.
controversial, I know,
Yes.
but again, don't be afraid of this. R.C. Sproul, probably one of the greatest Reformed theologians of the 20th century, believed it. N.T. Wright, a 21st century theologian, has argued for it. Lots of godly men have. And like I said, the final summation is just consider this, folks. This futuristic view that we're the last generation has been wrong over and over and over again for hundreds of years. Maybe it's the system that's wrong. It's not just, well, we were wrong then, but now we're right. We're wrong then, but now we're right. Maybe it's so open yourself up to at least look into these other systems and see what they have to say. And I think you'll be very surprised.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm looking forward to having you back again.
Likewise.
There's more to talk about.
And that brings us to an end of another episode. I want to thank my special guest, Brian Godawa, for sharing his deep insights with us once again. It's always a pleasure speaking with Brian. And remember, guys, take care of yourself. Don't wait to tell your loved ones you love them. Embrace them, cherish them, and cherish those moments and keep them close to your heart. And if you've enjoyed today's episode, please support the show by following us, reviewing, and sharing it with others. It's a big help. It's our best way for our Ohana to grow. And of course, you can find all the links and more ways to connect in the description below. Until the next time, guys, take care. Ahui ho kako. Bye.